today for our Theological Institute. During these weeks, we're studying hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is how it is that we interpret any written text, which in the case of the church means the scriptures. How do we interpret the scriptures? We talked last week about how it is that for any written text, what we have is we have the words, in this case of the Bible, of the scriptures. We have those words, and we have to figure out, what do those words mean? What is the world behind those words, the world behind the text? And also, what do these words mean for the world in front of the text? There were people who wrote these words in the ancient world. Now I'm looking at their words. What do these words mean for us today? That's the work of hermeneutics. Today we're going to continue our exploration of hermeneutics with the Hebrew Scriptures, what we as Christians often refer to as the Old Testament, but we recognize that to be more inclusive and so as not to offend our Jewish sisters and brothers who look to what we would ordinarily call the Old Testament for their scriptures, we often refer to them as the Hebrew Scriptures. In what language were the Hebrew Scriptures written? The Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, we also refer to as the Hebrew Scriptures. In what language were they written? They were written, of course, in Hebrew. We've tried a bit of Hebrew before. Remember, Hebrew is a language that reads from right to left, and so it's a very different language for us. It was in that language that the Old Testament, the first part of the Bible, was written, the Hebrew Scriptures, the scriptures that were written in Hebrew. Tonight, we're going to focus largely using this work by Father Lawrence Boat, who holds a place in my heart. He taught at the school that I studied at in Washington, D.C. He taught at the Washington Theological Union in Washington, D.C. He was a Paulist priest who wrote this 600-page book on the Old Testament. Tonight we're going to dwell on the 5 books of Moses, so you'll find that handout contained in the link below this video. I invite you to take a look at that. Tonight is on the 5 books that have traditionally been attributed to Moses. The 5 books that we today refer to as the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch, we know every time we see the root penta, how many sides does a pentagon have? 5. So the 5 scrolls that begin the Bible, the first 5 books of the Bible are known as the Pentateuch, or sometimes we also refer to them as the Law, or another word that we use is the Torah, Torah. The first 5 books of the Bible we know of as the Pentateuch, or the Law, or the Torah. What are the first 5 books of the Bible? We remember the acronym that we use. Think of a Notre Dame hair product. A Notre Dame hair product, Gel ND. The first book of the Bible, G is for Genesis. The E is for second book of the Bible, Exodus. The third book of the Bible begins with an L. What's the third book of the Bible? Leviticus. The fourth book of the Bible begins with an N, Numbers. The fifth book of the Bible begins with a D, Deuteronomy. Ooh, it's like a spelling contest here. So, the first 5 books of the Bible, again, the way that we remember them here at Holy Families, you think of it Notre Dame hair product, Gel ND, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The 5 books that we know of as the Pentateuch, or the Law, our Jewish sisters and brothers refer to it as the Torah, a Hebrew word. 5 books traditionally attributed to Moses, which is why this chapter is called the 5 books of Moses. So, we know that these 5 books contain this interesting history of creation. We start with the creation of the world, and then we narrow it down to one couple, Abraham and Sarah, and their descendants. We follow them along. We call that the stories of the patriarchs. That's all in the book of Genesis, the creation of the world and the patriarchs. After that, we come to the book of Genesis. Genesis is where God leads God's people out of slavery in Egypt toward the promised land. We refer to that event as the Exodus, when they were freed from slavery. The story of the Passover is told as part of the Exodus story, when it is that our Jewish ancestors had their last meal. Think of the tie to the Last Supper. They had their last meal of lamb. Think of the tie to Jesus, the Lamb of God, before leaving slavery and heading out, and God freeing them from slavery and heading them toward the promised land. Leviticus. Think of Leviticus as a book of laws and commands. The book of Numbers, more laws and commands. But also, Numbers continues the Exodus story. So Exodus begins the story of them leaving slavery. Numbers, after this book of laws, Numbers is a book of laws, but then continues the story of them wandering in the desert and being punished for 40 years. 40, of course, being a symbolic number. Anytime we hear the number 40 in scriptures, think of testing, challenge, sacrifice, right? Jesus was in the desert for how many days? 40 days, fasting and praying. Moses and the Israelites, for how many years were they in the desert? 40 years, a symbolic number of testing. Don't think necessarily that they were out in the desert literally for 40 years. Remember, these are stories. The Bible, as we're fond of saying, is not a book of history. The Bible is not a book of history so much as it's a book of theology, which means that it tells us about God. We can learn or study. Anytime we see ology at the end of a word, it's the study, it's the word on something, the logos. It's the word or the logos on what? On God. In Greek, the word for God is theos. We don't often see the theta is the th sound in English. Theos, God. What's the study or the word on God? The study of God is theology. When these 5 books were written or compiled, these people were trying to tell us something about God. So, in these first 5 books, traditionally attributed to Moses, we have Genesis, creation and patriarchs, Exodus, being freed from slavery, Leviticus, laws, Numbers, more laws and commandments, but also continuing the journey for 40 years. And finally, Deuteronomy is a word. Deutero simply always means second. Deuteros, right? Deutero, Isaiah is the second part of Isaiah. Onomy, anytime you see that, for instance, in autonomy, who rules in autonomy? I rule myself. So that means rule. So Deuteronomy is like a second rule. Deuteronomy. Autonomy, self-rule. So we have those 5 books that have been traditionally attributed to Moses. We're on page 90. We can think of it, there being various periods of promise reflected throughout these 5 books. Leading up to the moment are succeeding periods of promise in Israel's history. The age of creation in Genesis 1 through 11, followed by the patriarchs, Genesis 12 through 50, followed by the deliverance in Exodus 1 through 8. After that, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers are all about the law, and Deuteronomy, the final guidance and preparing to enter into the promised land. So, we say that these have been traditionally attributed to Moses. The question then arises, did Moses write these 5 books? Did Moses write the Pentateuch, or what we call the law, the Torah? Did Moses write all of this? Of course, that Moses wrote this was considered to be true for many, many years. These books have been attributed to Moses since the post-exilic period. Do you remember when it was that we returned from the exile? We wrote it up here just a few moments ago. It was in the year 539 BC. We were deported from our homeland in 598-ish BC. Came back to our homeland in 539. And so that was 59 years. About the time that we were coming back from the exile, 539, people were referring to these words as the words of Moses. So there's an ancient tradition of referring to these 5 books as the books of Moses that traces back to 539 BC when we came out of exile. On page 92, the challenge is, though, that Deuteronomy specifically says, this 5th book, that this is the words of Moses. The challenge being, as we see farther back into this book, when we start talking about Moses' death, obviously someone else had to write those words on Moses' death. Moses didn't write about Moses' own death. So these ancient peoples who believed that Moses wrote these 5 books came up with an explanation. What was their explanation? That Joshua, who was Moses' captain, who led the people into the promised land, that Joshua must have written the ending to that book. By the time of Christ, though, we recall in the Gospels, it was believed at that time, not only by Jesus of Nazareth, if the Gospels are to be believed, but also by Jewish authors like Josephus and Philo, that Moses authored these books. So it was a common belief that Moses was the author, that belief, of course, being rooted in the post-exilic period. Where do we find it? I talked about how it was that Deuteronomy says the words of Moses. Page 92 also talks about how it is, though, that Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 5 to 12, are those verses on Moses' death. So if you want, you might be able to check out in Deuteronomy 34, verses 5 through 12, those verses that refer to Moses' death. It was for reasons like that even someone like St. Jerome was known for translating the Bible, the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. He translated the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek, the Septuagint we called it. So St. Jerome, when he was translating the Bible, was noting various challenges with these 5 works. So he didn't believe that these words trace back to Moses. Instead, it was Jerome who believed that these words might be credited to someone like Ezra. There's a book in the Bible named after Ezra. Ezra was a priest in the temple who later we're going to see when these words were discovered, it was Ezra who discovered these words. I use those air quotes liberally because what we're going to see happen shortly is we're going to see that, to go back to the analogy of Grandpa Rudy telling stories for generations, and those stories being passed down and passed down and passed down, what happened is that all of these stories were passed down as stories or words of Moses that were later discovered in the temple walls. So when certain renovations were occurring at the temple, they discovered certain scrolls, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, which contained God's law. So that was the prevailing notion from the 6th century BC up until the 17th century AD. It was the likes of Richard Simon and Baruch Spinoza in the 17th century who started to see some real contradictions in these books, and who came to the conclusion that these 5 books could not have been written by a single person. They said, look at the language. Here, there are certain words in places where God is referred to in one way, but where God is referred to in another way in other passages. One person could not have done that. There had to have been at least two people, one using this word for God, one using this word for God, whose works were brought together to form what we have here. So they presented this theory in the 17th century based on two words for God. One of those words for God was Elohim. We're going to follow this because we're going to see one word for God, Elohim. When one author talked about God, they used the word Elohim. Of course, this is Hebrew. They didn't speak English back then. And then the other title that we see for God is Yahweh. So the question becomes, what should we call God? We're seeing two Hebrew words, one Elohim, one Yahweh, which leads us to begin to divide those passages. It's almost like taking a scissors to the Bible and starting to cut apart the passages that refer to Elohim. We'll put those into one stack or one column. Those that refer to Yahweh, we'll put in another stack or another column. And we'll start to see if this theory is correct of these books being written by at least two different people rather than by a single person. They started to note various differences. How it is, for instance, the one who used the word Elohim for God, for instance, in Genesis chapters 2 and 3, how it is that the style is more dry and list-like, while the other is more anthropomorphic. What does that mean, anthropomorphic? Anthropomorphic? Anthropomorphic. Anthropos, a Greek root meaning human. So when God is depicted more as a human being, that's being anthropomorphic. When we depict an animal, a donkey, as talking, that's an anthropomorphic telling of that story, with a donkey talking like a person. Donkeys don't talk like people. But if you write a story of a donkey who talks, that would be an anthropomorphic image. So when you make God seem like a human being, where God is walking in the Garden of Eden or talking with people, that's a very anthropomorphic view of God that we see in one author but not in the other. So scholars thought then that there were at least two earlier documents or sources that they referred to as the Yahwist source, of course, coming again from this root, the Yahwist source, and the other source, the Elohist source. So if we're going to use names, it's going to be based on these two different names for God that we see in these first 5 books of the Bible. Let's take the scissors to these pages and start dividing them. Those that use the word Yahweh, we'll put in the Yahwist column. That was written by this person. Those that contain the name for God, Elohim, we'll put in the Elohist column as being written by another person. And as if that were not enough, then we started to see that when we take the scissors to these 5 books, not everything starts falling neatly into these 2 columns. And so we start creating another theory or another source that we refer to as a priestly source. That of those things, when we take the scissors to these and cut out the references to Elohim and the references to Yahweh, put those into 2, then there's another voice that we see coming through here that we refer to as the priestly source. What we're going to start to do is we're going to start referring to these as by their first letter. The German word for Yahweh begins with a J, so we refer to this as the J source, to the E source, and the P source. So we see this priestly source that's very different too. The priestly source contains all sorts of laws, contains various lists of genealogy for us to be able to trace ourselves back, has various notes on liturgy, how they would pray and celebrate back then. We lump those into what we now call the priestly source of these 3 books. So far, so good? As if that were not enough, when we take a look at these books and start dividing them, it's like these, a lot of this, the first 4 fit more neatly into this, but Deuteronomy is like a work of its own. And so we often refer to a 4th source, which is the Deuteronomistic source, Deuteronomy is its own source as well. So rather than us thinking that just one person wrote any of these books here, what we'll start to do is we'll start to dissect them and see how it is the book of Genesis has different voices coming through it. How the book of Exodus has different voices. They're going to refer to God in different ways. It's almost like someone, perhaps from the priestly tradition, had different sources that came from one telling of the story and other sources from another one, where it's almost like they had a written document and they tried to bring them together and added their own parts to the story as well, creating what we have now in the first 5 books of the Bible. You can see how it is that some of these stories are blended together. For instance, there are different instances. Let's use the example of Noah and the ark, the flood story. We heard that 2 weeks ago on a Sunday. Do you remember the story of Noah and the ark? So take a look. We're at the bottom of page 93. Genesis 7:2 talks about how it is that Noah took 7 pairs of all clean animals and 1 pair of all unclean animals into the ark. We have this image of how it was that Noah only took 1 pair of each animal into the ark. Read Genesis chapter 7, verse 2. What did Moses take into the ark? 7 pairs of all clean animals. So that would be 7 pairs of cows, not 2 cows, but 7 pairs of cows. 14 cows went on the ark, according to Genesis 7:2. And 14 dogs and 14 cats, etc. But of the unclean animals, only 1 pair. So there were 14 cows, but only 2 pigs. That's Genesis chapter 7, verse 2. But in other places, like Genesis 7:9 and 7:15, it's a little different in saying that God told Noah just to take 1 pair of each. So the question is, did Noah take 7 pairs of each animal, of each clean animal, or only 1 pair of each animal? Obviously, both cannot be right, but it's not about one being right and one being wrong. It's about how it is that this is a book of theology, not a book of history. So there were 2 stories that were passed down. For the sake of the example tonight, let's use Grandpa Rudy's story, which talked about 7 pairs of each animal, and Grandpa Mario's story of 1 pair of each animal. And we brought together Grandpa Rudy's story and Grandpa Mario's story, and the priestly scribes who were pulling this together sort of pulled those stories together and tried to add in their own to those stories, and that's what we have that results in each one of these Bibles, is a mixing of stories, a mixing of traditions. Other places where we see things a little differently, for instance, in the book of Genesis chapter 37, we're still on page 94. Genesis 37, Grandpa Rudy's story talks about how it was that Joseph's brothers wanted to kill him, but Reuben pleads for his life. Grandpa Mario tells the same story, but in his story, it's Judah who pleads for Joseph's life. Who pleaded for his life? Was it Judah or was it Reuben? Was it Reuben? It's different stories that we attribute to the fact that there were different authors whose stories were coming together to form what we now have as the Joseph story. When Moses went up the mountain, one author calls the mountain Mount Sinai. The other refers to the mountain as Mount Horeb. Did Moses go up Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb? Same mountain. One story used Sinai, one story used Horeb. So in the Bible we hear them both being used. That's another hint that probably it wasn't one person who used 2 different names for the mountain. It was 2 different people who called that mountain by different names, whose stories were brought together in these books. The final example that's used on page 94 is that when we went into the promised land, who did the promised land previously belong to? Grandpa Rudy's story said it belonged to the Canaanites. Grandpa Mario's story to the Amorites. The Canaanites or the Amorites, again, another example of how it was that there were two different stories coming together, and now we have the challenge of reconciling them, leading us to believe that it wasn't one person who told the story. It was two different stories that were now being brought together. It was in 1878 that Julius Wellhausen actually proposed what we now know of as the documentary source here of this four-source theory of where these 5 books come from. That it wasn't just written by one person, Moses. It was Wellhausen in 1878 who said, I have this theory that there are 4 different voices that can be heard in these 5 books. Not written by a single voice, but by at least 4 different voices. 1878. So all of this is relatively new. It's only been 140 years that we've had this theory of studying the Bible and being able to see it through these lenses. According to Wellhausen's theory, at the bottom of page 74 then, it was this Yahwist account that came from the north and was combined with the Elohim account. Actually, it was just the opposite there. The Yahwist source was in the south, near Jerusalem, mixed with the Elohist account from the northerners, right? When they combined the two of them then, it was the priests and the Levites and the prophets who tried to bring together the two and who brought in many of the laws and the genealogies, supplemented those works. And then there was the book of Deuteronomy, which pulled together the northern and southern traditions as well. And so it's actually what we refer to today as the 4-source theory. How it was that the Pentateuch, the Torah, these 5 books of the Bible, were not written by a single person, Moses in this instance, but were instead written as the recording of 4 different strands of tradition. In this book by Father Lawrence Boat, Reading the Old Testament, if you turn to page 96, I really like this diagram on page 96 because it starts to show you how it was that we started creating this. You see the timeline on the left, which starts at 1800 BC through 450 BC. 450 BC gives us the Bible as we know it today with those four strands of the J, the E, the D, and the P. Do you see that? J, E, D, P, all in the Bible that resulted after 450 BC. Before then, though, what we had was, first we had the Yahwist account, which is the oldest account, somewhere around 900 BC. So the Yahwist account was putting in writing around 900 BC, these taking various songs and sagas and oral histories and myths, taking a book of Yashar that we haven't yet found but is referred to there, taking various customs, taking various legends and pulling them together into the Yahwist account about 900 BC. So we have this as the most ancient of the voices, the J strand, you might call it, or the Yahwist account. It refers to God as Yahweh. After that, you can see around 800 BC, this other box, the E box, see where that's coming from? Where the E box, the Elohist account, is now being influenced by various songs and sagas and oral stories. How it is that that's going to be mixed in with the J account, and suddenly you have these 2 different accounts of creation or of the flood story. The Deuterus, the D strand, is going to come in about 600 to 700 BC, so that by the time that we are getting out of the exile, we're finding these 3 strands, the D, the E, and the J, the Deuteronomy, Elohim, Elohist, and Yahwist strands, and the priestly clan, the scribes, are going to bring them all together into one book that is found in the temple walls, which is the Word of God that we have today, found in these 5 books. These 5 books then come from these voices working together. The oldest strand, the Yahweh's tradition, the J on this chart, being the E being added to it, then the D being added to it, and then the priests taking all of that and adding rituals and laws to all of that to create what today we know of as these 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. We'll pause there and let that sink in. So of these various strands then, the Yahwist strand is going to have the more anthropomorphic view of God as God who magically appears in the garden and who talks, who speaks with Abraham, etc. The Elohist is going to have a more distant God. The Deuteronomist is going to later be introducing a lot of the more ethical concerns that the prophets were trying to introduce, seeing the people turning their back on God and going astray. The Deuteronomist is going to be the one to try to be pulling them back in. The Deuteronomist is going to be aware of Ezekiel. So we know that Deuteronomy was written sometime after the prophet Ezekiel, because the Deuteronomist is pulling in Ezekiel's words and tradition. And then finally, the priestly source is the one that brings in all of the cultic aspects, the legal aspects, the laws into these books as well. So on page 97 then, page 97 of Father Boat's book, we can see this, the 4 columns to be able to talk about how it is that those are a little different from one another. How the Elohist, for instance, was the tradition from the north, Grandpa Rudy there in the north, the Yahwist tradition from the south, from Judah, Grandpa Mario there in the south. The priestly tradition, of course, centered around the temple, was in the south as well, and then it starts to delineate how it is that those 4 voices come to be heard in these 5 books, how we start to tell those voices apart from one another. That brings us to page 98 in Father Boat's book. Page 98, he starts exploring the Yahwist strand in this 4-source theory. We're going to take them one by one. Let's start with the oldest, which is the Yahwist strand. We often refer to that as the J author, which comes from the German word for Yahwist, begins with the J. So we use J as the author for that. That's the author who then brought old poems and stories in the old song of Exodus and pulled them together into a story of God's actions, dating all the way back to the beginning of the world. So how it was that God created us, and then through the event of the Exodus, God saved us. That author, the Yahwist strand, liked to put words into people's mouths, especially into famous people's mouths. So they're going to have Moses saying all sorts of things, but also have God saying all sorts of things. Speech is coming from God's own mouth, whether that's to Adam and Eve, or to Noah, or to Abraham. For the Yahwist, the great storyteller, again going back to the analogy of Grandpa Rudy, right? Loved to tell stories about certain things like conflict between brothers. How it is that there was a certain sibling rivalry going on, say between the likes of Cain and Abel, Cain killing Abel, between the likes of Isaac and Isaac's brother. So we're going to have different stories of the various conflicts, or actually of Jacob and Esau, the rivalry between the 2 of them. The triumph of the younger brother over the older brother, as in the stories of Joseph and in the story of Jacob. It's the youngest brother who triumphs. Of wives who can't bear children, that's a Yahwist theme, that Sarah could not bear children, but God blessed Sarah, and so she bore children. The same with Isaac's wife, Rebekah. The same with Jacob's wife, Rachel. All 3 were barren. They were women who could not have kids, but God blessed them, and they were able to have kids. That's the Yahwist, who when the Yahwist tells stories, enjoys telling stories with certain themes like that. That brings us over to page 101. On 101, we see how it is that the Yahwist likes to talk about human freedom. Adam and Eve were free to eat the fruit or not to eat the fruit. How it is that human beings have certain freedom, and sometimes we use that freedom in evil ways to do evil, and how it is that God, despite that, continues to be loving and kind and compassionate and merciful. So the Yahwist author is creating this theology, one view of God, explaining the faith of the Jewish people through one lens, one perspective. Are you ready for the Elohist tradition? The Elohist tradition, then, on page 101, the E source comes to us from the northern kingdom. After it was established, remember, after King David was the king of the United Kingdom, we call it. After his death, his descendants divided the kingdom into the north, Israel, and the south, Judah. And so it's the Elohists that tend to have more northern ideas. The Yahwist, more ideas from the south. The Elohist, ideas more from the north. They knew the northern cities, so obviously they were more familiar with the northern geography. They talked more about a suspicion of authority to those who are claiming power. J is more concerned with leadership, Moses being the leader of the people. E, more suspicious of people who say that they're talking for God or are in leadership positions. E, being in the north, there were other gods that were being worshipped in the north, like Baal in the north. And so there is a strong slant against other gods by the E author of this work. Because there were other gods in the north, it was the author in the north, the Elohist author, who talks about the threats posed by the worship of other gods. Elohist never talks about God walking in the garden or talking with human beings. It's more of a distant God who talks with God's people through messengers. Think, for instance, in the stories of Abraham, we have two different views of God. We have one Abraham who comes and speaks with a God who speaks with Abraham. That's one tradition, the Yahwist tradition. In another tradition, another set of stories, the Elohist talks about how it is that messengers came to speak to Abraham on behalf of God. Right? Remember when Sarah was going to be pregnant, it was 3 messengers who came from God to speak with Abraham and to Sarah. In the story of Isaac, how it is that God sent a messenger, an angel, according to the story, to be able to tell Abraham not to sacrifice his son. So we have these two traditions. In one, the Yahwist tradition, God speaks with the people, God's self. In the Elohist tradition, God sends messengers. Two different theologies, two different views of God. Does God directly speak with us, as the Yahwist suggests? Or does God send messengers? Does God speak to us through other people? Or through messengers like angels? The Elohist tradition. The Elohist on page 102 is more interested in this theme of the fear of God. And so in the Elohist, we're going to find all sorts of passages. They're on page 102 that talk about the fear of God. Why did Abraham obey God, and why was he ready to sacrifice his son? Out of fear of God. Genesis 22:12. Joseph feared God. Israel feared God. Moses feared God. The elders feared God. If you take a scissors to these 5 books and start cutting out the passages about fearing God, we tend to lump those then with the Elohist author and attribute that theme to him or to her. The Elohist author is more interested as well in ethical and moral questions, whereas the Yahwist author, the J, reflects more the ideals of David's kingdom and the hopes for Judah. So it's interesting, the J, being in the south, is more centered around the temple. E, in the north, is more centered around the people in the wilderness. So it's interesting, these different sets of stories. One centered more on God's presence in the temple, One centered more on God being in the wilderness with God's people. And then finally, the priestly source. To supplement both the J and the E strands, we have this priestly source, which took them. Obviously, the priestly source knew Ezekiel, and so they start pulling in, other elements, like the rituals that were happening, like obeying the Sabbath, their holy day, the origins of circumcision, of cutting the foreskin from all males to identify them as Jews. All that's based on these priestly rituals at that time. The role of the high priest, of course, that was something that came more from the priestly tradition, something that we don't see in these more primitive traditions. In the priestly tradition, we find the genealogies. The genealogy, who descends from whom, who is that person's parents and grandparents, etc. A way for us to be able to trace all the way back to Abraham, and then all the way back to Noah, and all the way back to Adam and Eve. Those were the priests, the scribes, who were adding those genealogies into these 5 books. Place names, the priests were adding in place names, and noting how it was that laws were established for future generations. It wasn't just for them back then, but was also for us today. An emphasis on God's word, an emphasis on blessing. And then on page 105, we start seeing a schema of how it is that these priestly authors started taking Grandpa Rudy's stories and Grandpa Mario's stories, the Elohist and Yahwist stories, and started telling them with a certain structure. So the priests were starting to give structure to these stories, we see at the bottom of page 105, so that whether we're telling the story of Adam, or of Noah, or of Abraham, or of Moses, we're going to see a similar structure of blessing and of promise and of obligation as a result of the relationship that we have with God. The other interesting thing to note about that is how it is that God is given different names, Elohim, or El Shaddai, or Yahweh. How interesting. We're taking these different stories and pulling them together now. So that was the theory, the 4-source theory of the origin of those 5 books that was given to us by the 4-source theory. Again, going back to Wellhausen in 1878, after he published his work setting forth this 4-source theory, we believe that this was probably how it was, because this was a guy who was speaking with some authority. But then we have other persons like Gunkel, who, now we come to page 106, started questioning this theory. And thinking, well, if the priests were the editors, they were pretty bad editors, because they were bringing together these stories and allowing conflicting details as part of this. They were allowing repetitions and contradictions, right? If we were editing these 2 traditions and bringing them together, like bringing together 2 different books, wouldn't you be more careful about these things? And so it was Gunkel who on page 107 came up with this theory that it was probably a person like Ezra who at that time pulled together all of these and then found them in this book that was discovered in the temple walls. Whew. So, as page 107 points out, there are other sources that these books pull from that have been lost to history. Things like, on page 107, it talks about the Book of Wars of Yahweh. It refers to this source that is now lost to history. Maybe one day we'll find the Book of the Wars of Yahweh. We haven't found it yet. Or the Book of Yashar, found in Joshua 10:13. We haven't found this, but there are other sources, obviously, that were influencing the people who were telling these stories. And so, one of the great things, since we refer to this as our Bible study every week, is part of our study of the Bible is not just taking these words literally, as some persons in other faith traditions do, but really starting to analyze and study. If this is a Bible study, let's study how it is that something like this even, where we had 5 books that were traditionally attributed to one person, Moses, from 539 BC until 1878 AD, right? That's for 2,500 years, we believed this Moses theory of Moses writing this, and now suddenly for the last 140 years, we can open our eyes to a different thought on where it is that these words come from, and we can analyze these words and see how it is that there are different themes, different words that allow us to take our scissors, if you will, to the Bible and start placing different passages into different columns, and we come up with a very different theory of the origin of these words. And so, if you're interested on page 108, there are various study questions there. If anyone in our parish, for instance, were studying for the priesthood, it would be important for a person to know the answers to these questions. To have read a chapter like this, and then to be able to answer questions on page 108, right? Well, if someone were to ask, well, tell me about the origin of the book of these books, right? Who wrote these books? That obviously this sets us up for a deeper exploration of the themes, not just saying that they were written by Moses, an ancient theory, but instead beginning to see how it is that we see different themes that we can start putting into different buckets or columns based on those words. So next week we'll continue our study then with the book of Genesis. We're going to start going through some of these in a way in which we're trying to make sense of them. We refer to this mini course as a course in hermeneutics, how to understand the Bible. So we'll start taking a look at some of these ancient stories and trying to figure out, okay, who was writing these words, to whom, when, and where, and what significance those words have for us today. So as we continue to explore the Bible together and to learn more and more about hermeneutics, how to interpret the Word of God, let's keep in mind how it is that when we start really studying the Bible, it's much more rich than any of us could have imagined. Much more rich than many people imagine when they pick up the Bible and just open it up and start reading. If we were to actually start studying the Bible, we have all sorts of fascinating insights, both in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, the Christian Scriptures, those that were written in Greek, even more fascinating as well. Shall we conclude with a prayer? Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and forever shall be, a world without end. Amen. Thanks for joining us. Tune back in next week.
Oh, Miss Cloud.